Hello everyone and welcome to this Net Zero Live webinar sponsored by Kingspan. My name is Carl Brown. I'm the assistant editor at Housing Today, and this session should be a good one. It's called The Steps for the Built Environment to Hit Net Zero. This topic could hardly be more topical following the worldwide efforts to limit global temperature rises to 1.5%, which have obviously been in the spotlight over the last couple of weeks at COP26. The UK is now legally committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and the heat used in buildings and industry is estimated to account for around a third of total greenhouse gas emissions. So delivering net zero carbon buildings has to be a priority. We all kind of know this, but what does that actually mean in practice? To help us understand more about this, I'm joined by Rita Singh, who's the head of UK Public Affairs at Kingspan Insulation. Hi, Rita.
Hi, Carl.
And Rita will tell us more about the characteristics of a net zero carbon building and the future legislative roadmap that will hopefully get us there. So I'm shortly going to hand over to Rita, and she's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes or so. And then hopefully we will have time for quite a few questions at the end. If you do want to ask Rita a question, all you have to do is pop it in the questions box, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll try and get to as many as I can towards the end. I think that's all the housekeeping from me. I'm now going to hand over to Rita Singh from Kingspan. So Rita, over to you.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you everyone for joining this session. As Carl says, I'm Rita Singh. I'm head of UK Public Affairs for Kingspan. In this presentation, we'll be looking at how the performance of our buildings will need to change as the UK works towards, as Carl was saying, its net zero carbon target by 2050. This will include reviewing some of the features of net zero carbon buildings, how changes to the building regs and other legislation are expected to raise our built environment to the standard, and the challenges the industry faces in delivering this. So I'm hoping to cover quite a bit in this session. So the risks presented by climate change are well known. As part of the effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the UK is now legally committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The UK's net zero strategy, which was published just under a month ago, outlines the targets across different sectors. So for power, all electricity to be generated by low carbon approaches by 2035. It's expected that demand will increase by 40 to 60% in this period. So investment in the network is required for areas such as electricity storage and flexible grid management to ensure energy security. On fuel supply and hydrogen, emission savings are expected to be achieved through the electrification of power generation. This will be offset to a degree by the anticipated ramping up of hydrogen production, although this will provide carbon savings for end-use sectors. On transport, we obviously have the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles expected to end by 2030. These will be replaced with zero-emission vehicles. There is also support for an increased focus on public transport and cycling. For natural resources, we have peat restoration and afforestation expected to play a significant role. Energy crops are also anticipated to increase, whilst more biodegradable waste should be diverted away from landfill. On industry, decarbonisation will be achieved through resource and energy efficiency, fuel switching, and carbon capture. And finally, the government will look to address emissions from buildings by raising energy efficiency and transitioning to low carbon heating. If we look at this category in more detail, it is estimated that emissions from the heat and building sector equate to approximately 17–18% of total emissions. And many of our buildings are not up to the high energy efficiency standards in the rest of Europe. In fact, in 2017, the annual temperature-adjusted emissions from homes actually rose by around 1% relative to the previous year. For this reason, the Climate Change Committee and the Bay Select Committee has recommended that energy efficiency of all buildings is considered a national infrastructure priority, and a number of key changes to building regulations and other legislation are expected in the coming years to deliver this. So if we look at the pathway to net zero and exactly what is ahead of us here in the UK, at this stage, several key dates and targets have already been mapped out. Later this year, England will be publishing updates to Part L of the building regs, which deals with energy efficiency of buildings. Wales will publish its own versions in 2022, These updates are seen as a stepping stone, allowing the industry to upskill and prepare for the future homes and building standards due in 2025, when all new homes and most buildings are expected to be net zero ready. This means they will need to be built to ultra high levels of energy efficiency, with heating demand similar to that of the passive house standards, around 15 to 20 kilowatt hour per meter squared per year. Scotland is expected to publish updates to its own energy efficiency regulations at the start of 2022, coming into force later in that year. They will then implement a new low carbon heating standard in 2024. This will initially apply to new homes, with similar requirements to be phased in from 2024 for new non-domestic buildings. Northern Ireland have set a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 35% by 2025. Keep in mind that at the same time as delivering these improvements in energy performance, the UK is also looking to significantly increase the number of homes being built. In addition to these changes for new buildings, the government is also expecting the energy performance of existing homes to be upgraded, with all homes raised to an EPC certificate of at least C, where practical, affordable, and cost-effective by 2035. This is likely to affect around 15 million homes in England alone. We'll look at how this might be achieved later on in the presentation. For UK, it's also committed to cutting emissions by 78% by the same point. For Scotland, by 2025, it's expecting to achieve net zero, with England reaching the net zero target in 2050, whilst Wales is expected to achieve a 95% reduction in emissions in the same year, although they are aiming for 100%. We've already talked a bit about the net zero carbon building, so it's perhaps useful to provide some clarity on what we expect these to look like. The UK GBC, the Green Building Council, has provided a very handy one-pager on net zero operational carbon, which sets out the key features anticipated for these buildings. So looking at each one of these individually, on low energy use, it's talking about adopting a fabric-first approach to minimize the energy demand of the building. And on space heating demand, it should fall to below 15 kilowatt hour, below the passive house standard for all building types, or on par with the passive house standard requirements. For low carbon energy supply, it's calling on heating and hot water to not be generated using fossil fuels. Expected that grid energy will be decarbonized and heating switched to low carbon technologies such as heat pumps and heat networks. On-site renewable electricity should be maximized wherever possible. Reporting of average annual carbon content of heat supplied, and for energy demand response and storage measures to be incorporated, and the building annual peak energy demand to be reported. On measurement and verification, it's calling on annual energy use and renewable energy generation on site to be reported and independently verified in use each year for the first 5 years. This can be done on an aggregated and anonymized basis for residential buildings. On reducing construction impacts, it's calling on embodied carbon to be assessed, reduced, and verified post-construction. And finally, on zero carbon balance, it's calling for a carbon balance calculation on an annual basis to be undertaken, and should be demonstrated that the building achieves a net zero carbon balance. Any energy use not met by on-site renewables should be met by an investment into additional renewable energy capacity off-site, or a minimum 15-year renewable energy PPA, a power purchase agreement. A green tariff is not robust enough and does not provide additional renewables. The upcoming changes to Part L focus primarily on the first two areas: reducing energy demand and implementing low carbon supply. But this poses a question. If supply is being decarbonized, why is it necessary to adopt a fabric-first approach at all? So the UK net zero strategy has identified several benefits which can be achieved by decarbonizing buildings by a fabric-first approach. Providing the measures are well considered and properly designed and installed, they can provide what the report calls a no or low regret action, delivering lasting energy savings. This can lower operating costs and also help to protect families from fuel poverty. This is particularly important given the expected changes in fuel taxes over the next decade. At present, gas is taxed at a lower rate than electricity. However, the rapid decarbonization of grid energy means that it now has lower carbon emissions than gas. As a result, it is expected that tariffs will increase on gas and fall on electricity. This may risk pushing households into fuel poverty if homes do not use energy efficiently. In combination with effective ventilation, the fabric-first approach should also help to create healthier environments with improved thermal comfort and better air quality. A Bayes study further identified that homes with higher EPC ratings may be worth more than worse performing alternatives of similar characteristics. Work to install energy efficiency measures is also expected to support local supply chains and businesses. In addition to these points raised in the report, the introduction of low carbon heating also necessitates an improved building fabric. Heat pumps, for example, operate most efficiently at lower flow temperatures than conventional gas-powered systems. This means homes will heat more gradually, and for effective performance, it is essential to retain as much of this heat as possible. If not, the heat pumps will need to work harder to heat the homes, potentially considerably raising running costs. There's also a further issue of seasonality in demand. As we decarbonize further and move to electrified heating and hot water provision, reducing demands in the winter months will become more and more important. Carbon intensities will be higher in the cold, dark winter nights. Renewables such as PV generate less electricity, whilst air source heat pumps, which operate by extracting heat from the external air, have to work harder to heat properties, meaning they draw more power. If we push more and more buildings as well as transport to the grid, there is a worry that unless demands are minimized, the carbon intensity at these times could even creep up rather than reduce. The graph on screen demonstrates this. The majority of solar energy is generated in the summer months, but the peak demand from the house is in the winter months, the blue line. This also poses an issue for energy security. There was an analysis done by a group called UK Fires based at Cambridge University and showed that if net zero emissions are reached solely through electrification without supporting energy saving measures, there would be a projected supply shortfall of around 40% by 2050. It's therefore important to limit demands to reduce reliance on generation. If at peak heating demand periods, systems underperform, the heating approach used might suffer reputational damage from not being able to compensate for high demands. This actually happened under the 2006 Part L1 regulations change, when the Code 4 loophole overly rewarded heat pumps to the extent that the building fabric could be heavily relaxed by some house builders and a dwelling would still pass. This then led to heating systems underperforming during the coldest periods when air source heat pumps are least efficient, as those systems couldn't compensate for the inflated heat demands. The occupiers and the national press unfairly pointed the finger at the heating systems not performing adequately, and the poor fabric was a large part of the reason that the heating did not perform well. A key driver in the transition to net zero carbon buildings will be the building reg standards relating to building energy performance. As mentioned, these are contained in Part L to the building regs in England and Wales and Section 6, Energy Section in Scotland. All three, England, Scotland and Wales, have all been consulting on changes to this area of their respective building regulations due to come into force in 2022. Whilst the final versions of these updates are yet to be published and are therefore subject to change, the consultations give a useful indication of the direction of travel in each region. So briefly look at what has been proposed in each of the regions. So if we look at the proposals in England and Wales, these set out 4 key performance metrics which homes must meet. The headline change is in the carbon emissions metric, which are expected to require that emissions from new homes are 31% lower than under the existing version of Part L in England and 37% lower than the existing requirements in Wales. A new primary energy metric has also been introduced, replacing carbon emissions as the principal metric in both the English and Welsh versions of Part L. This change reflects the fact that as grid energy is decarbonised, a carbon emissions target will be less useful in ensuring the building uses energy efficiently. Primary energy is a measure of how much raw fuel is used to generate a unit of final energy, from extraction to transportation to use. As such, renewable technologies perform well under primary energy metrics, especially when specified on-site, and will provide designers with compliance benefits under 2021 updates to Part L. As with the existing standard, clear minimum levels of fabric performance are also set as a third performance metric. These have been tightened in both regions, although requirements in Wales will be tougher than those in England. Both regions also incorporate a final metric relating to energy efficiency. In England, the Fabric Energy Efficiency Standard, will be retained. This essentially sets a maximum space heating cooling target, which the building must meet in SAP calculations. In Wales, there's a new affordability metric expected to be introduced. This is based on the SAP Energy Efficiency Rating, which is one of 2 metrics used within the EPCs. The higher this rating, the lower the running cost. The proposed score of 81 puts the minimum performance level at the bottom of Band B. The notional dwellings, which are used to set the performance targets for all metrics other than the minimum fabric parameters, are similar in England and Wales. These will use wastewater heat recovery and PV as a standard. However, developers are free to adjust this spec, providing the dwelling meets all of the performance metric targets and doesn't exceed the minimum fabric performance parameters. The consultations also briefly cover the updates due in 2025, when new homes will essentially need to be net zero ready. These include tighter building fabric requirements, along with the use of low carbon heating, such as heat pumps, as standard. In Scotland, consultation on energy standards is currently ongoing, closes at the end of this month. The consultation proposes 2 emission reduction scenarios for new dwellings, representing a 32% and a 57% reduction in carbon emissions over the present requirements. Rather than providing notional dwellings for different fuel sources, as in the existing Section 6, the consultation version proposes creating 2 notional dwellings, one using an air source heat pump to be used for properties featuring heat pumps, and one with a gas boiler for all other fuel types. It's worth noting that in cases where a building is fitted with a gas boiler or other non-zero direct emissions technology, the developer will also be required to detail the process for how this can be retrofitted with a zero carbon alternative with minimal disruption. As with the English and Welsh consultations, the Scottish document considers the introduction of primary energy as the new primary metric, with carbon emissions used as a secondary metric. Consultation notes that this may cause issues due to the way emissions and primary energy are dealt with in SAP, and so as an alternative, a direct energy metric has been suggested. The consultation also notes that analysis of EPC data showed that in many cases, only marginal improvements in fabric performance were delivered in homes built to 2015 standards. Instead, project teams chose to install renewable energy such as PV. Scotland is seeking to avoid this going forward. To achieve this, it is recommending more detailed assessments of on-site renewable generation to confirm what percentage of this power is actually used by the building, rather than applying a full emission credit to any electricity generated on site. The minimum fabric requirements are much tougher in Scotland. In fact, the worst case U values set in the more ambitious consultation option are better than those used in the notional dwelling in England and Wales. Similarly, the notional building packages for both options represent a step up over the fabric requirements in England and Wales. If we look briefly at the requirements for new non-domestic buildings, these proposals are currently at an earlier stage than for domestic. However, there are a few points of note within the English and Welsh consultations. It's proposed that the 2021 versions will either require emissions for the average building to be 22 or 27% lower than at present in England, and 18 or 28% lower in Wales. In both cases, the governments have stated their preferred option is for the more ambitious option. The following performance metrics will be used for new buildings through Part L 2021 in both regions, and these are the primary energy target, the CO2 emission target, and the minimum standards for fabric and fixed building services. The proposed minimum fabric standards in England are significantly upgraded over the existing requirements, but in Wales, the changes are much smaller. Overall, there are also some minor improvements to the proposed non-domestic notional building spec for England and for Wales, primarily for side-lit and unlit heated buildings. Although this package only sets the carbon and primary energy targets, a lot of people use these values as a starting point. In Scotland, there are again 3 key performance metrics. They're looking at options providing either a 16 or 25% improvement over current CO2 emission targets. Keep in mind, these are already tougher in Scotland than in England and Wales. They are consulting on whether primary or delivered energy is used as the primary metric for new non-domestic buildings. Renewable generation will also be more carefully studied to exclude any on-site generation which is exported to the grid. 2 upgrade options are also offered for the final performance metric, minimum fabric performance. Even the weaker of the 2 options would bring these requirements more into line with the current requirements for domestic buildings in Scotland. As a result of these changes, the proposals for the notional building in Scotland are notably more ambitious than those in England or Wales. As with the changes for domestic buildings, the number of notional building options will be reduced to 2, with an air source heat pump option for buildings using that technology and a boiler for all other fuel types. It's also proposed that the fuel used for domestic hot water in these buildings is separated from space heating. This means that if heat pumps are used to provide space heating in a zone, while gas provides hot water generation, these can be considered separately. The exception to air tightness testing on small multiple units less than 150 square meter and large extensions will be removed, and both SIPC TM23 and pulse testing adopted. Whilst on paper these changes should deliver the energy and carbon savings, it's important to keep in mind that good fabric performance extends beyond specification. It also requires close attention to detailing, both during design and construction. The performance gap is a well-documented issue which arises after the building process of the home and of the materials used are not the same as those specified in the design phase. Research from the Passive House Trust has suggested that the average home may actually use around 40% more energy than predicted at the design stage, with heating demand sometimes 2 to 3 times greater. The Climate Change Committee highlight that this can cost consumers somewhere in the region of £70 to £260 per year. The English, Scottish and Welsh consultations include recommendations to help address the performance gap for new domestic buildings. Good thermal detailing is vital when insulating to the levels in the consultations, as thermal bridges can easily undermine overall building performance. The English, Scottish and Welsh consultations focus on this area. Under the proposed changes, the approved construction details associated generic psi values, the measure of heat loss through a junction, will be withdrawn. The global backstop default thermal bridging level would worsen, and unless developers have modeled or calculate the PSI values available, the somewhat poor individual junction backstops will have to be used. In practice, other areas of the spec have to be significantly upgraded to achieve a compliant construction when using these backstops. So actually paying attention to detail will be very important to establish a cost-effective solution. Kingspan are one of a number of manufacturers and industry bodies to provide calculated details and guidance reflecting actual build-ups. Keep in mind, however, that these will not cover every scenario, nor should they be blindly followed. To achieve best practice, designers should not only look to limit heat loss at the junction, but also consider structural requirements, fire safety, and ensure the junctions are buildable. Modern methods of construction approaches offer some key advantages in this area, as many details are pre-planned and factory cut, making it simpler for them to be delivered in the final construction. This is why MMC is a popular choice for passive house projects where optimal fabric performance is required. Attention to detailing is also vital for establishing air tightness. All new dwellings in England, Wales and Scotland should be air tightness tested, including small developments. This requirement will ensure that all dwellings, regardless of the size of development, meet the standard. The new standards will also introduce a lower limit for both as designed and as built air permeability in SAP for naturally ventilated dwellings, so no benefit to energy efficiency for values below this level. An independent approved air tightness testing methodology will be set, the SIPC TM23. Pulse testing will also be introduced as an additional approved air tightness testing method. Once again, the factory manufacturer of MMC or off-site methods of construction make them well suited to delivering properties which reliably meet their air tightness targets. As well as ensuring the property meets air loss targets, it is also important to ensure effective ventilation is provided. Ventilation and risks of overheating will also be increasingly important as homes become more energy efficient, so it is essential that these are addressed in conjunction with increasing the energy performance of the building. The regional consultation suggests a new section of the building regs is created, focusing specifically on overheating risk. In both cases, they propose 2 routes should be made available to achieve this. A simplified route, which sets a maximum glazing area and minimum open area, such as window openings, for ventilation based on the building type and location. And a dynamic thermal modeling route, requiring a trained engineer to assess overheating risk of the building under the methodology within the CTM 59. Aside from cost, one of the biggest barriers to building improvement is lack of information. For example, lots of useful information is collected during an EPC assessment. At present, however, this isn't formally collated anywhere, meaning each assessor has to essentially start from scratch. This adds cost and disruption and can make it difficult to properly assess areas which have been covered up, such as cavity walls. One solution is a building passport. This provides a digital repository for all building-related information, such as plans, fire safety strategies, maintenance records, etc., which can be updated as remedial work is undertaken. This would provide the golden thread recommended in the Hackett report, delivering a clear paper trail which all parties can access. This passport concept also looks at a building as a whole and its occupants' needs in the round, with longer-term planning and interventions that consider interactions between elements and what is right for the building's performance and safety. Tailoring a plan of interventions as part of a whole building consideration is key to better outcomes. Whilst the building passport isn't part of the current proposals, new compliance reports are set to be introduced in England and Wales. These will require contractors to photograph all key junctions before they are concealed to prove they match the details. These will be submitted to building control and could form the basis for a passport in the future. If we return briefly to the UK GBC's net zero building proposal, a key aspect missing from both the domestic and non-domestic consultations in England and Wales is a key metric focused on in-use energy monitoring. Understandably, this has drawn criticism from a number of industry bodies, including RIBA, Chartered Institute of Building, and the UK GBC. In-use monitoring is a vital part of closing the performance gap, as it allows issues to be identified and corrected on project, and lessons to be learned and shared to improve overall building practice. The consultation for Part L 2021, new non-domestic buildings in England, does include a requirement for commercial and industrial offices in England and Wales with a floor area greater than 1,000 square meters to disclose annual energy ratings for their properties. Further consultation from BEIS has now fleshed this out. Policy is being modelled after a scheme currently operating in Australia called Neighbours. The ratings would be generated through sector-specific requirements, which consider aspects such as occupancy, location, and operating hours. This would allow buildings to be benchmarked both against their peers and in relation to the net zero trajectory. Aside from requiring businesses to declare their ratings on an annual basis, however, it is not yet clear how these in-use ratings will be used. So we've focused so far on new build, but what about the UK's large existing building stock? Achieving higher standards via retrofit is expensive and more complicated compared to doing so in new dwellings. While the majority of this presentation has been geared to new builds, it is important to reflect on the UK's existing housing stock, which will make up around 80% of the housing stock in 2050. Housing stock is amongst the oldest and least efficient in Europe, with more than half the properties having been built before the 1965 building regs introduced the first requirements for thermal insulation. More than 12 million homes fall below the C grade on EPCs graded from A to G. We estimate that around 25% of homes don't have an EPC at all, and therefore we don't know their energy performance. These will likely be existing buildings, as it has been a legal requirement for all new builds to have an EPC since 2008. It's also a challenge on the regulatory side. At present, improvements are only triggered by extension or other works on buildings. How do we encourage change? Each building poses different challenges based on factors such as its location, condition, age, design, etc. Package of energy efficiency measures needs to be adapted to these requirements. To establish and uphold practice energy efficiency retrofit work, a new retrofit standards framework has been introduced which seeks to avoid piecemeal implementation of energy efficiency measures by requiring the characteristics of each property to be carefully assessed and a medium-term action plan created before any measures are introduced. Central to this framework are new public specifications, PAS 2035 for domestic and PAS 2038 for non-domestic. These clearly identify the process by which a property can be assessed, how energy efficiency measures should be chosen in response to this, and outlines how long-term monitoring can be carried out. They also clarify the responsibilities and qualifications for individuals involved in the retrofit process. The spec dovetail with an updated version of PAS 2030, which now solely focuses on the installation, commissioning, and handover of energy efficiency measures. So if we look briefly at PAS 2035, projects should follow a clear step-by-step process. A retrofit coordinator will initially have a conversation with the owners to discuss their budgets and goals. If the owner and occupier is interested in getting work done, then the coordinator carries out an initial risk assessment of their home. They then rank the home from A as low risk to C, high risk. A retrofit assessor then carries out the whole house dwelling assessment, considering all factors which may impact energy retrofit, such as its design, condition, location, and existing problems such as damp. A retrofit designer uses this report to create the package of energy efficiency measures. This is developed into a medium-term improvement plan, maybe up to 2050, by the retrofit coordinator, who then gets it approved by the client. The coordinator briefs the installers who complete the installation and commissioner as per PAS 2030, 2019 version. The retrofit coordinator then collects all the documentation such as guarantees and briefs the owner on how to operate the energy efficiency measures if needed. A retrofit evaluator then undertakes post-completion assessments to confirm the energy efficiency measures are performing as expected and recommending remedial work if needed. The framework also requires all project teams to log their work in the Trustmark data warehouse. This functions much like the proposed building passport, allowing all key paperwork to be stored in a single location which can be accessed by all members of the project team, along with any contractors who work on the property in the future. A separate portal is also available to the customer to allow them to access certain key files. We would strongly recommend that project teams involved in energy retrofits engage with this process. It is also worth noting that all Trustmark registered businesses who carry out these retrofits are required to be trained to PAS 2030 and to complete work in compliance with PAS 2035. Trustmark status is expected to be a requirement for contractors undertaking work under any future government-funded energy retrofit schemes. If we look at how the government intends to drive energy retrofits, one of the key legislative schemes are the minimum energy efficiency standards. These set minimum EPC requirements that all rented properties, subject to some exemptions, must meet. All domestic properties which require an EPC must achieve at least an E before they can be let to new tenants or have the tenancy renewed. This will also apply to non-domestic properties from 1st of April 2022. Steps are now being taken to tighten these further. In Scotland, the minimum certificate will rise to a D from 1st April next year, whilst in England, the minimum is expected to be raised to a C in 2027 and a B in 2030. The current scheme promises hefty punishments, including fines reaching into the thousands, but there has been a good deal of criticism over how it has been enforced to date. To address this, the new consultation not only sets out the roadmap for tightening the minimum EPC requirements for these buildings, but also sets some clear recommendations on how this can be better enforced. Some of the key changes proposed include the creation of a central compliance database where a building's current status can be logged, a requirement for buildings to continually hold an in-date EPC, as the certificates are valid for 10 years, and to carry out post-improvement recertification, and a requirement for letting agents to only advertise and let properties with a valid EPC. Aside from the minimum energy efficiency standards, a number of alternative schemes have been suggested to support uptake on energy retrofit for existing buildings. In addition to ongoing support for upgrading fuel-poor homes via the Energy Company Obligation Scheme, The heat and building strategy has also outlined a number of other measures, and these include grants of up to £5,000 towards the cost of fitting heat pumps via the boiler upgrade scheme, although this has been limited to just 30,000 households per year. A £60 million innovation programme to drive down cost of heat pumps, and £800 million in new funding for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and £950 million for the Home Upgrade Grant Scheme to support low-income households. Additionally, a number of further schemes have been suggested, flexing the stamp duty or council tax paid on a property depending on its EPC rating, requiring to openly declare likely operational costs along with monthly mortgage fees, green mortgages offering discounted rates if homebuyers commit to energy improvements within 2 years, and reducing VAT on energy efficiency measures. It remains to be seen what approaches the governments in England, Scotland and Wales will take. However, significant long-term schemes will be needed if the country is to meet its net zero ambitions and if we're to learn from the Green Homes Grant Scheme short-term lived experience. Before I finish, I just wanted to let you know about what we as a company are doing in terms of delivering on the net zero targets. As global leaders around renewables and energy efficiency sectors, Kingspan is not only looking to develop and manufacture advanced products to allow our customers to shrink their energy demand of their buildings, but we also seek to hold ourselves to higher standards. To achieve this, we've created a Planet Passionate program. It's a global 10-year program with which we look to drive energy and carbon out of our business operations and supply chain, as well as increasing our recycling of rainwater and waste, whilst also accelerating our participation in the circular economy. The targets as part of this include achieving net zero carbon manufacturing by 2030 through a combination of process improvements, energy efficiency, and renewable energy use. Working with our primary supply partners to achieve a 50% reduction in carbon emissions intensity of the primary raw material supplied to us by 2030. Upcycling of over 1 billion PET plastic bottles into our manufacturing processes by 2025. We're already recycling around 500 million PET bottles globally in 2020 as part of this effort. In 2020, Kingspan was a signatory of the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree commitment, which committed us to raise our ambitions in line with limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. By signing, we became part of the Race to Zero campaign, building momentum for the shift to a decarbonised economy. We're also working to deliver decarbonisation across the construction sector as part of the World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero programme. Finally, earlier this year, the group committed to reducing absolute Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2030 from a 2020 base year, and also pledged to reduce absolute Scope 3 emissions by 42% within the same timeframe. The ambitious new targets are in line with the scale of reductions required to keep global warming below 1.5 from pre-industrial levels. So to conclude, the UK's net zero carbon targets are set to have a significant impact on how we design and construct buildings. So it is important for all of us within the industry to get up to speed with the likely requirements. Under the new versions of Part L due to be published at the end of the year, new properties will need to be built to excellent fabric standards. Heating systems should either utilize low carbon heating such as heat pumps or be designed to operate at lower temperatures to allow these technologies to be easily retrofitted. With the accredited details being removed, designers will need to pay much closer attention to delivering details that are accurate and workable. Additional focus is also needed on both air tightness and ventilation to help shrink the performance gap and avoid adding to the retrofit burden in the future. Contractors will need to take pictures of their work as they progress to prove good workmanship. Whilst in-use monitoring of building energy performance is not included as a key metric within either the domestic or non-domestic consultations, many industry bodies are pushing for it to be included to fully close the performance gap. Energy retrofits are more expensive and challenging and need to be tailored to the requirement of each building. The retrofit framework provides a well-considered approach to addressing these projects. Measures such as the tightening of the minimum energy efficiency standards should help to support some retrofit work, but further government schemes will be needed. I hope you found this informative. We do offer a number of other free CPD seminars for architects and specifiers, covering topics such as thermal comfort in schools, flat and tapered roofing, VIPs, and benefits of premium performance insulation. And we're also working on new CPDs to cover the changes in Part L and Section 6 in more detail, each one lasting just under an hour and can take place via video conference. At this point, I'd like to thank you for your time and pass you over to Carl.
Thank you, Rita. I thought that was a really interesting look in detail at what constitutes a net zero carbon building and some of the legislation affecting it going forward. I quite like the fact that it kind of felt like a broad overview and a deep dive at the same time, which
we're trying to get a lot in there.
Yes, I thought it was very useful. We've had quite a few questions from the audience, but I just want to ask one or two first quickly. I was wondering how you think individual organisations in the built environment should measure progress on net zero. On Housing Today yesterday, we published a guide to the leading house builders' commitments on net zero, and they all seem to be using slightly different metrics and ways of measuring their success. So how can we be confident we are measuring progress consistently on the route to net zero, and is that important?
Thank you, Carl. Very, very useful conversation, given we've just come out of COP26. And what was heartening to see is buildings were featured in the NDCs of quite a number of the countries, obviously to a varying degree of success. But in terms of a company being able to measure its own success in this area, there are a number of metrics. And I think this is one of those things that I think we are still working towards. So as an organization, we have signed up to the Science Based Target Initiative, which becomes verified, and you measure your performance to make sure that you meet the 1.5 degrees challenge. So I would certainly recommend larger organizations to sign up to that and make sure that their targets are based around that 1.5 degrees. For other organizations, I know work that the Construction Leadership Council has been doing on their Constructio framework has been very valuable. And so they have kind of themed measurements around 3 areas of building activity, construction, and transport, with 9 targets, and are looking to measure progress against this. But that's probably more at a construction level rather than individual companies. But there's some excellent work that UKGBC and LETI have been producing, which are looking at how companies should be looking to measure their own progress. Because if you measure, then you know how well you're performing. And there's a number of metrics I'll be happy to look into and share some details on the ones that we have explored that we are following. If anyone's interested, I can certainly send the links through.
Okay, thanks, Rita. And then my second question was about really just off the back of COP26. It was about I suppose really the ambition of the government's policy following COP26. Do you think the pledges in terms of the built environment go far enough? And should, for instance, the Future Home Standard requirement be brought forward? Would there be any downsides of that being brought forward?
Yeah, very good points, actually. I think it's fair to say that everyone came away from COP26 with something to be disappointed by. But I think on the whole, I think there was a sense of urgency. I was able to join the Built Environment Day and able to see, some of the huge range of conversations that were taking place. And there are positive things to take away from what came out of COP, because there were a number of agreements, commitments that people were able to sign up to. So whether it was elements around finance or methane, or some of the other elements that were seen as positive. Regarding, I had never paid so much attention to language. Which is stronger, to urge something or to request? Because again, when you look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is seen as the more stronger to request, apparently stronger than an urge. There you go. And the whole thing around phase down or phasing out coal. So obviously, there were the elements of this that, people came away thinking, okay, if only we could have tightened this. In terms of the positives that I took away from this, I think the sense of urgency. People are no longer talking about this is only going to affect our grandkids. These are affecting us now. We are experiencing climate change, so people need to look into this. I was encouraged to see that the NDCs, majority of NDCs, looked at the impact of building efficiency in order to help them reach their NDC targets. These are the national determined contributions, so each country sets out what their emission reduction plan is in these NDCs. And building efficiency was mentioned. Variety of success, so anything from recognizing buildings have a role to play to actually specifying, yes, building codes and retrofit and energy efficiency. So the pledges were heartening to an extent. We just need to keep the momentum building on this. What was interesting is if we look away from governments and what are called non-state actors, that would include businesses, NGOs, civil society in general, they showed leadership, and there was a lot more coming through from non-state actors. So the whole Race to Zero campaign and what the high-level champions did in kind of almost energizing us all to come together and say, yeah, we can deliver against this and we can show leadership, and this is what we're committing to. Because in the run-up to COP, I think we all saw the constant, net zero commitment announcements coming left, right, and center, which was fantastic. Now we cover something like over 70% of GDP being covered by net zero emission targets, which is fantastic. So there are elements of success that I think we can take away from COP. In terms of UK more specifically, I mean, Future Home Standard, it's a shame that we have a two-step process where we have Part L coming through 2022 and then another one in 3 years' time for the Future Home Standard. I think when the Future Home Standard was introduced, I think for at least 6 hours when they published the first time, at one point it did say the Future Home Standard would be introduced in 2023. So we all got very excited by that. And by the next morning, we saw that that had been deleted and then changed to 2025. It is a shame, but I can see that they're trying to create this sort of stepping stone to get to more tighter Future Home Standards. But then, perhaps this is something for the industry to show that we can deliver against this, because we're not waiting for any new technology to be discovered, to be developed. We have the technology, we have the scope, we have the systems in place to get to net zero ready homes. So we can start to deliver against them. I think the Climate Change Committee reports have said how expensive it is to retrofit rather than build net zero ready homes now rather than retrofit later on. So I think all of the signs show that it's better to start building net zero ready homes now. If only policy could match ambition, would have been fantastic. But yes, I think we're going in the positive direction at least.
Okay, that's great. It's great to hear some positivity about COP. Okay, I'm going to go to the audience questions now, and the first question is about Fabric First. It's more of a statement actually, so I might reframe it as a question, but it's from Peter Durant, and he says Fabric First is okay for homes, but not necessarily for commercial industrial buildings, where internal heat gains can be higher and increase the need for cooling. So I'm guessing what Peter is wondering is whether, to what extent we need a slightly different approach for non-residential buildings, or whether we need a balanced approach between things.
I think that's right. We do need to look at each building individually, rather than just take a one size fits all approach. And I think the work that UKGBC have done in terms of looking at they've looked at 5 different ways, 5 different issues to consider in terms of net zero carbon buildings, one of which is that zero carbon balance. So I think it is important to make sure that you're not just looking at one thing to be the right solution for everything. It does need to be looked at in its entirety. But you can't move away from the fact that your fabric does need to be quite tight, because if you do improve, look at heat gains, you still don't want a leaky building at the end of the day. And if we are looking to decarbonize our energy, then we do need to make sure that we're not increasing that demand. We are kind of making sure that it's a more efficient, optimized system than just looking at one thing over the other.
Okay, that was very succinct. I like that. There's another question from Bob Eden, who he's after magic bullet ideas for how to approach retrofitting of listed buildings or buildings in conservation areas.
Oh, that's a very good question. Magic bullet ideas. I mean, there are some very interesting case studies that I came through. I think one of the historic building associations, I can't think of the name, they were looking at different buildings. Again, each building is very different. And I think there has been some fantastic work being done where they recognize that, energy efficiency needs to be improved. I know there were a couple of examples of forts and castles around Wales where they've looked at improving energy efficiency. So they're looking at community energy schemes that then support those sort of national trust type buildings and improving energy efficiency whilst also looking at community energy schemes for that community. But again, yeah, I'm sorry to say, Bob, that I don't have a magic bullet, but I know that there is some really good activities. Again, if I find those case studies, I'll be very happy to share them, but there are some really interesting work coming through because again, these are what they call the hard to treat areas. And, you know, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think what we've seen with a lot of these successive government grants is they kind of pull at the low hanging fruits. But the hard to treat homes, you know, as I was saying in the presentation, you know, a lot of the homes were built pre-1965 where we didn't have thermal insulation even mentioned in building regulations. So we don't know what state those buildings are in. And we need to make sure that any grants coming through from government don't just go for the easy reach where you're just doing loft cavity and things, but you're actually able to look at solid wall and able to fund development and energy efficiency measures on solid wall and some of these historic buildings as well. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, and you do need a package of measures with something like this. You can't just take an individual measure approach. You need a whole house retrofit package with things like this, and ideally a whole street or a whole community. Because I know in Wales they were looking at things like the Arbed scheme, where they're looking at a whole community or a whole street approach. So that kind of gives you better, you know, scale in terms of the implementation, the energy efficiency measures you're looking to put in, as well as the cost being able to come down, because if you're taking a whole street approach, then you're able to bring costs down. So there's a lot of work to be done, not just looking at the specific elements and technologies that can go in, but actually what is the better way of improving those at scale.
Okay, thanks for that, Rita. The next question I'm going to take is from Michael Pizzarello, and it's about inspections. And he says, my concern is the inspections required during the various stages of construction or retrofit might not be adequately or diligently undertaken. Self-certification might not deliver the level required. How are governments going to ensure that the inspections, etc., are done properly? I just wondered whether you had any ideas about that.
I mean, this comes to the whole performance gap issue, is what's designed is what you're getting as built. I mean, building passports need to be the way we go down this road. We're seeing with EPC certificates and things where, you know, you always have to start from scratch, which seems completely unnecessary. And when you're looking at inspections, if they don't come in the time of construction, then you have a lot of things that have now been sealed. So yes, the Part L changes are now looking at those sealed areas to be photographed through this compliance reporting system. I think we do need to be more ambitious and just go with something like a building passport, which gives you the opportunity to put in everything from design to construction to ideally in use as well, and to follow that whole thread through, which will make inspection much easier and to be able to trace things back at the construction stage and even the design stage. I really can't see how we can not have a building passport. It just seems like such a, you know, a simple, sensible approach to address and to begin to implement. I mean, maybe the compliance reports and things are a starter for 10, but I think those sort of things, technologies that we have in place that we can start to implement, could make these things much easier to start. And I know with the Hackett report and some of the work that through the building safety program, they are looking at rolls up inspections and things like that. But I think at our level, you know, the information that we can provide through building passports and things seem very sensible approach to take.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question is about heat pumps. I think this was from Bob Eden again. And it ties in with something that I wanted to ask as well. So he was talking about why is there all this talk about heat pumps and not PV, solar, wind? You know, is there evidence that heat pumps is more efficient? Obviously the government published its heat and building strategy a few weeks ago, which had a heavy focus on heat pumps and you know, and indeed there was criticism about the lack of a national retrofit program, which is perhaps another point. But why do you think there's so much focus on heat pumps as opposed to other solutions?
I think that, I mean, the heat pumps is directly in I suppose, response to the heating technology we have at present, which is very reliant on gas. So there was a lot of discussions around hydrogen boilers or heat pumps, and the heat pumps seem to be the most viable option for majority of the houses that we have at the moment. And obviously, you know, through the industrial clusters, they are trialing hydrogen boilers in a number of areas. I think in the northeast, I think they've got an industrial cluster where trialing some of this. The heat pumps seem to be the answer to moving away from gas boilers. I mean, I would still say that I think from the information that we've been reading from the Climate Change Committee, the National Grid and various others, getting your fabric addressed will still be a very important thing, irrespective of what technology you use. And we don't necessarily want, and we really don't want to see the technology being the answer to getting to net zero. Because if you're still relying on electricity and you still have a leaky house, you know, given where we've, you know, the sort of things that we've seen with energy prices at the moment, you don't want to be left with a leaky home with all of the technologies in there. So you do want to improve the efficiency of your homes first. But after that, I think the technology needs to be suited to the homes. I would say that, you know, PV needs to be there at standard alongside the wider packages of things like heat pumps or whatever the most suitable one is. I know government is looking at starting with those not on the gas grid at the moment. But I think it's a, you know, there's a lot of information at the moment where you have one versus the other. And I think we need to start looking at this to say which is the best option rather than this is worse than this. We just need to look at the houses, which is the best one that's needed for that house or that development area, rather than, you know, kind of picking one against the other. And I think if we do a whole house review and we look at what the housing, the energy demand of those houses are going to be, and look at it from that side, then I think the technology range we have available should be able to meet whatever energy efficiency measures we need to address it. Okay. Sorry, I haven't answered that directly, but it's a difficult one to say, well, I don't think heat pumps are good enough, because I think they all are, as long as they're applied at a whole house retrofit level. They all need to be looking at what is the energy demand and what's the best measure suited to that development.
Okay, thank you, Rita. We've only got a minute or two left, and I just wondered whether you could really just maybe talk about the key takeaways from today, and also maybe just touch on what you think the biggest barriers are to achieving net zero in the built environment.
In a minute.
In a minute.
Great. So the key takeaways, I think, again, you know, on a positive outlook, we have policies going in the right direction. We have regulations coming through from England, Wales, Scotland, slightly at different levels in terms of the requirements, but I think it's kind of going in a more positive direction. It'd be great if the pace of change was faster. That would be my key takeaway, and the more industry can do, and industry leadership has now been recognized, especially through things like COP and people seeing that non-state actors can deliver against this. So I think that's a positive. We have the technology, we have the ability. There are some things where, you know, things like building passport and elements like that just need to be brought sooner. And I know there's some fantastic work being done through things like the Green Finance Initiative, LETI, UKGBC, and others who are looking into this direction. Yeah, so overall positive direction. I think there is a lot more that we can do. Fingers crossed on with the policies that come through, and the sooner we can start to implement them. But yeah, very much in the industry's hands to make sure that we can deliver and get our homes net zero ready.
So brilliant, thank you. It's nice to end on a bit of a rallying call for the industry there. Okay, so that's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thank you once again to Rita. This session will be available on demand to rewatch at your leisure, as will all the Net Zero Live webinars taking place this week. Do look out for another Net Zero Live session on the heat and building strategy at 11:30. But that's all from us now, so thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.